Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 10th. On this day, back in 1980, two teenage boys, 16-year-old Stephen John Wood and 17-year-old Lawrence Eugene Sharp, vanished from different parts of Southern California. Both were last seen in the company of a man who at the time was already carving a deadly path across the region. That man was William Bonin, later known as the Freeway Killer. These weren't isolated disappearances. They were part of a spree that would eventually claim the lives of at least 21 boys and young men. While Bonin's name would go down in history for the horror he inflicted, the real story belongs to his victims, Stephen and Lawrence among them, whose lives were taken far too soon. Today, we're taking a closer look on what happened on April 10th, 1980, and how two families' worst fears became part of one of the most disturbing serial murder cases that California has ever seen. Let's get started. Born in 1947 in Connecticut, William Bonin's early life was not a happy one. He spent much of his youth in group homes and juvenile detention centers, which are environments that he later described as traumatic. And these experiences would be cited in court cases down the line. As a young adult, Bonin served in the U.S. Air Force during the Vietnam War. After returning home, he settled into civilian life in Southern California. On the surface, he appeared pretty ordinary, but behind closed doors, his darker urges were already beginning to surface. Throughout the 1970s, Bonin was arrested multiple times on charges involving minors. He underwent psychiatric evaluations, and experts consistently warned that he posed a serious risk to reoffend. But despite those red flags, Bonin was released from parole supervision in early 1980, just months before he began the most violent phase of his life. Between 1979 and 1980, Bonin drove the highways of Los Angeles and Orange counties in a green van hunting for teenage boys. These weren't impulsive crimes. He planned them carefully, bringing restraints and other materials with him. His attacks also followed a deliberate pattern: abduction, control, and ultimately fatal violence. And he didn't always act alone. Over the course of his spree, Bonin recruited several younger accomplices, some still teenagers, who helped him find and overpower his victims. Thursday, April 10th, 1980 was a typical spring day in Southern California. 16-year-old Stephen John Wood and 17-year-old Lawrence Eugene Sharp were both out in Long Beach that day, each going about what should have been an ordinary routine. Stephen, a high school student from nearby Bellflower, had left home that morning to go to a dentist appointment. He planned to head back to school after it was done. Lawrence, who also lived in the Long Beach area, was reportedly spotted in the same part of town that afternoon. But by the end of the day, both boys had vanished, and both would later be identified as victims of William Bonin. According to later reports, Stephen might have known Bonin through his older brother, which could explain why he felt comfortable getting into the van with him. As for Lawrence, it's believed that he also may have crossed paths with Bonin before, or was approached in a similar way. The exact details of how each of them ended up with Bonin that day remain unclear, but what we do know is this: Stephen and Lawrence were both last seen alive on April 10th, and their lives would intersect with Bonin's just a few hours later. Their sudden disappearances raised alarm right away. When they didn't come home that evening, their families reported them missing. Search efforts began that very night, but no one could have imagined at that point the true horror behind what had happened, or that these two boys were part of a much larger and far more sinister pattern. 3 days after Stephen Wood and Lawrence Sharp disappeared, the search for Stephen came to a devastating end. On April 13, 1980, Stephen's body was discovered in an alleyway just off the Pacific Coast Highway in Long Beach. It was a horrifying scene. Stephen had been discarded like so many of Bonin's other victims, left to be found by an unsuspecting passerby. The condition of his body told a grim story. He had been sexually assaulted, bound, strangled, and showed signs of torture. For Stephen's family, this discovery was the realization of their worst nightmare. And then, just the next morning, another family's nightmare came true when police made another chilling discovery. In Westminster, just a few miles away from where Stephen had been found, Lawrence's body was located behind a gas station. Like Stephen, he had been sexually assaulted and strangled. 2 young lives were stolen. 2 bodies were discarded in public places just miles and hours apart. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that these were not random acts. The similarities were too striking. They were looking at the work of the same person, and possibly someone who had done this before. Still, despite all of this evidence, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. Early in the investigation, law enforcement struggled to make sense of the case. The only obvious links between the victims were their age, gender, and the brutal manner in which they were killed. There were no eyewitnesses, no solid forensic leads, and no suspects. As days turned into weeks, the case began to grow cold. But behind the scenes, detectives kept working, and the community, already on edge, was starting to sense a larger threat. News of Stephen and Lawrence's murders began to make its way across Southern California, joining a growing list of unsolved killings that bore eerie similarities. It wouldn't be long before authorities started to connect the dots and realized that a serial killer was moving among them. For months after the murders of Stephen Wood and Lawrence Sharp, the investigation was stuck. The body count was rising, but there were still no solid leads. But then, a break came from an unexpected place. In the spring of 1980, William Pugh, a 17-year-old acquaintance of William Bonin, was arrested for auto theft. At first glance, it seemed unrelated to the growing string of unsolved murders. But when Pugh realized the trouble he was in, he made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he agreed to talk. Pugh admitted that he had been present for several of Bonin's murders. He'd helped Bonin abduct victims, teenage boys just like Stephen and Lawrence. During questioning, Pugh shared specific details about Bonin's crimes, details that hadn't been made public. With that information, investigators finally had something solid. They began piecing together the connections they'd been searching for, and all signs pointed back to Bonin. Armed with this new intel, authorities put Bonin under surveillance, and they didn't have to wait long. On June 11, 1980, just 2 months after Stephen and Lauren were killed, police watched as Bonin approached a teenage boy at a bus stop in Long Beach. The boy seemed hesitant, but Bonin was persuasive, just as he had been with his previous victims. He coaxed the boy into his van, and that's when police moved in. They caught Bonin in the act, assaulting the boy inside of the van. He was arrested on the spot. Once Bonin's van and home were searched, police found a trove of damning evidence. Restraints, weapons, sexually explicit materials, and even newspaper clippings about the unsolved murders. But the most critical piece of evidence came from the van itself. Forensic testing directly linked it to the killings of Stephen Wood and Lawrence Sharp. After months of fear and unanswered questions, authorities had finally found the man responsible. Bonin's arrest didn't just solve the murders of Stephen and Lawrence, it opened the door to unraveling a much larger pattern of violence, one that would eventually be traced to at least 21 victims across Southern California. After his capture, Bonin was formally charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The charges spanned across several counties in Southern California, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. From forensic links to eyewitness accounts and testimony from accomplices, the case against Bonin proved to be airtight. His trial began in 1982. Prosecutors laid out the grim details of his crimes, acts of violence that had taken place over the course of a year and a half. While Bonin didn't act alone in every case, he was unquestionably the driving force behind the spree. In court, the prosecution painted a disturbing picture. Bonin had deliberately targeted vulnerable young boys, hitchhikers, runaways, and teens walking alone. But Bonin's defense team tried to shift the narrative. They pointed to his traumatic childhood, his time in group homes and juvenile detention, and the psychiatric issues that he had struggled with for most of his life. They argued that years of abuse and neglect had shaped his violent tendencies and suggested that he lacked the ability to control his impulses. Perhaps the most disturbing moment of the entire trial came when Bonin took the stand. Instead of offering remorse or even a defense, he calmly admitted to the killings, saying, quote, "I couldn't stop," end quote. He showed no emotion, no regret. In 1983, William Bonin was convicted of 10 murders in Los Angeles County and sentenced to death. The following year, he was convicted of 4 more murders in Orange County and received a second death sentence. Through it all, he showed no remorse, only detachment. It was clear that Bonin felt no empathy for the pain he had caused. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he spent the next 13 years on death row, filing appeals and delays. But in 1996, his sentence was carried out. William Bonin was executed by lethal injection, finally bringing a measure of closure to the families of his victims. The arrest, trial, and conviction of William Bonin brought an end to one of the most terrifying serial killing sprees in California history. But for the families of his victims and the communities he left shaken, the nightmare didn't end there. For the loved ones of Stephen Wood and Lawrence Sharp, the loss was permanent and devastating. Stephen's mother, in particular, struggled to come to terms with the brutal way her son was killed. In the years that followed, she and her husband moved to rural Arizona, hoping that distance might ease some of their pain. But the grief never truly left her. She later spoke about how her life had been ruined by Stephen's murder, how the trauma had hollowed out any sense of normalcy in her life. Bonin's crimes also exposed serious gaps in how law enforcement agencies communicated with each other. Because Bonin moved so easily between counties, it took longer than it should have for authorities to see the bigger picture. In many ways, his case became a turning point, a wake-up call about the need for better coordination between jurisdictions. The formation of interagency task forces and more unified data sharing can, in part, be traced back to lessons learned from this investigation. But while Bonin's name is written into the darkest corners of California's criminal history, it's the names of his victims that deserve to be remembered most. Stephen Wood, Lawrence Sharp, 2 teenagers with their lives ahead of them, taken by a man capable of unthinkable cruelty. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!